Hi, I'm Jim Linnell. I want to introduce you to another friend of mine, Jesse Smith. Jesse is a saddle maker. He's someone that has been a saddle maker most of his life. And he's very good at it. In fact, he teaches classes on saddle making, and he taught actually at Spokane Community College, had a course there that he taught. He's an Al Stoneman Award winner. He probably is one of the most knowledgeable people you'll ever meet about the Northwest style of leather carving. He's someone that he's worth listening to, and I'm glad we can share him with you today.
Yeah, I'm Jesse Smith, and I live out of Pritchett, Colorado. I get our mail out of Pritchett. I actually live 32 miles from the town of Pritchett in southeastern Colorado. And I got started doing leather work when I was in the Air Force. I went down to the hobby shop and watched a guy carving on a belt, and I decided that that didn't look like it was all that hard, and that I'd like to give it a try. And I've been doing leather work ever since. That was back in, would have been 1958 that I did my first bit of leather carving. And I made my first saddle in 1963 for my dad. He had an old wore out saddle, and I knew he never would buy him a new one. And so I told him one time if he'd buy the material, I'd make him a saddle, and he did, and I did, and I've been making saddles ever since. In 1965, I had a guy call me from Spokane, Washington, and he was looking for a saddle maker that I'd met previously in Denver, had went to work in Spokane, and so this guy was looking for a hired man, and the guy gave him my name and phone number, and he called me up, and I moved to Spokane and started making saddles full-time for a living in April of 1965. And I've been doing it for a living ever since. I worked for the guy for 7 years and ended up buying the shop part of the business out, and I've been in business on my own ever since then. In 1979, the college, Spokane Falls Community College, called me, and they had started a saddle making program there, and they called me and wanted me to come to work teaching for them, and I told them, well, I was really too busy to teach a saddle course, that I was working full-time in my saddle shop. And the guy said, well, we have an instructor here that's not working out, and we need somebody to replace him. And so it was winter quarter coming up, and winter's slower for me than any other time of the year. So I told him, what I'll do, I'll come and teach winter quarter. That'll give you time to advertise for a new instructor, and so they said that sounded good to them. So I taught through winter quarter, and they put out applications for full-time instructor. And by that time I decided that teaching wasn't all that bad a deal after all. And so I put in an application on it, and 21 years later I retired from teaching at the college. And that was in 2000. We were splitting my granddad's ranch up, and I got a chance to move back to Colorado and live on part of my granddad's ranch. It was a homestead that he homesteaded originally in 1915, and I'm living 3 miles up the canyon from where the main headquarters of the ranch is. And I was born in that house, however, too, so I got tied fairly closely with the ranch there. And we have a small ranch now. We run a few head of cows, and my wife does most of the cow work, and I spend probably 6 days a week in the shop, and sometimes 7 days a week, and making saddles. And then I started about 3 years after I moved back to Colorado. I had a guy wanted me to teach him to make a saddle, and so I told him, yeah, I'd go ahead and do that, and I taught him. And then so ever since that time, for about 15 years, I've been teaching saddle making students. A 5-week program, and they make one saddle in the 5 weeks they're there, and then they go on their own way. And I just now this spring decided to close my saddle making program. I got way too busy to do it anymore. I was falling behind on my orders. My customers were getting upset at me, and so I decided that something had to give somewhere, and I decided to close the saddle making program. And so now all I'll do is my own work, and I'd a whole lot rather do it myself than just show somebody else how to do it. So actually in the beginning, I didn't have anybody that was an inspiration to get started. After I had moved to Spokane though, I got to know several saddle makers, an old time guy, Pat Devaney, who was from Lewistown, Montana originally, and he was working for our competition there in town, Indiana Harness Company. And he was an inspiration to me. Also Bill Long, the guy that I'd met in Denver that actually was responsible for me getting the job, he was an inspiration on his work. And a lot of the old time saddle makers like Duff and Bill Sevier out of Pendleton, Oregon, and a lot of those early time guys. Don King in later years was, an inspiration to me also. And that's really all the names that I can come up with right now that really sort of helped me along the way as I was going. So, well, one thing I want to say, that Pat Devaney that I mentioned earlier on, and I met him, he was working at Indiana Harness. He was from Lewistown, Montana, a really old time saddle maker, and he used to come and hang around in my shop all the time, and I didn't know whether, that he never really said a whole lot about my work. He'd just watch me and hang out in there whenever he'd get a chance. But one time he came and he had visited with me for about 6 hours in the shop, and he said, I got something out in the pickup you got to see. And he brought it in, and it was a little carved fender about that tall. Really nice floral carving on the front of it. And he flipped it over on the back side and handed me a pen, and he said, here, sign it. And I looked down the list of the saddle makers that were listed on the back of there, and all of the premier guys that I'd heard about for many, many years. And to me, that told me that Pat Devaney decided I'd made it. And to me, that was a really important for an old timer that was doing as good a work as he was doing to, concede that I was sort of in the group then. So Al Shelton, I did visit him a lot. I was doing the show in Santa Clarita, California, and I would, when the show was over with, I would drive over to Studio City and visit Al Shelton. And I'd been introduced to him by Chuck Smith. I took the Chuck Smith carving course down there at the Gene Autry Museum one time. Chuck called me and invited me to come down and take his course. And it was Chuck Smith, Ray Poya, and Jim Jackson were the instructors in there. And one night, Chuck took us over to Studio City and introduced us to Al, and we went and had lunch with him and everything, and visited quite a while. Went back to his shop and looked at all the interesting stuff that he had in his shop, and so then I knew him, and so when I'd go to Santa Clarita, I would drive over after the show was over with, and I'd visit with Al for quite a while. He'd always get his guitar out and play some music, and then he'd hand me the guitar and he'd say, here, you play one. And I said, Al, I don't know how to play a guitar. But he thought that I should, be able to play the guitar. So he was quite an old character. So, and then I knew Cliff Ketchum. I don't know whether you're familiar with Cliff Ketchum or not.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I met Cliff, when he was in Milton Freewater, Oregon, toward the end of his life. And I used to take my saddle making class through on a field trip every year. Some years we'd go east toward Sheridan, and some years we'd go south to Ray Holt's Saddle Company, Hamleys, Sevier Brothers, and we'd stop through Milton Freewater on the way down and visit with Cliff quite a bit. And after Cliff passed away, his daughter contacted me about selling Cliff's tools for her. And I told her, yeah, I would be interested in selling them. And she said, what kind of commission do you want? And I told her, well, is 10% fair? And she said, yeah, that's fair. And I said, I'll take it in tools rather than money, you know. So I went through and inventoried the entire bunch of tools that I got from him or from her, and figured the total value of all of the tools, and I figured the 10%. And so then I took, 10% of the tools that were ones that I was interested in. And so I got some really premier tools that Cliff Ketchum had used, throughout the years. So.
Awesome.
And she said Cliff had always spoke highly of me when, we'd stop by and my students would visit with him. And he'd take them in the shop and show them how to design patterns and showed them about saddles that he was working on. And at that time, he was really getting into airbrush stuff. So a lot of his work, he had a nice saddle in there one time that had a lot of really fancy airbrush stuff on it. And it was great to visit with guys like that. So. And then we'd stop in Hamleys and visit the Hamley shop. And in later years, I had a couple of students that went to work for Hamleys for a period of time. I also had a couple that went to work for Ray Holt Saddle Company in Grainsville also. But yeah, meeting a lot of the guys that, you'd heard about forever, like in Hamleys down at Pendleton, Oregon. I had a guy that came to work for me back quite a few years ago. He had been a leather cutter for Hamleys for 22 years, and when Hamleys closed their saddle shop, of course he quit and came to Spokane and worked at White's Boot Shop for about a year, and he wasn't really happy doing that kind of work. And he'd been a leather cutter for Hamleys. He wasn't a saddle maker, but he was as knowledgeable about cutting leather and sewing and finishing and that kind of thing as anybody that I'd ever met. And he came and worked for me for about 9 years, I think it was. And he was a really good employee because you never had to oversee him and make sure he was doing the kind of work that you wanted done, because he knew probably more about a lot of this stuff than I did. And so I'd just tell him, Lee, I need like a dozen pack saddles made up, and he'd go make them up, and you didn't have to worry. He'd have them all done, and there they were, and I could go do my work and not have to oversee what he was doing. So, that was a good deal there. So, well, I'm in the process of writing a book on the Northwest leather carving, and I've been doing research for the last couple of years on where the Northwest style originated from. And it originated out of Ray Holt's shop in Grainsville, Idaho. But there's controversy on, whether Ray was the one that actually originated that style, or whether a guy named Bill Knight that came to work for Ray back in the early 40s was actually the one that originated. In the general consensus of most of the people I've talked to, saddle makers and saddle shops and stuff, agree that the style was actually originated by Bill Knight rather than by Ray Holtz. That Bill came to work for Ray, and when Ray saw the quality of the carving that he was doing and the style of carving he was doing, that they changed their way of doing. And I don't have this confirmed, but that's what the general consensus is, that it was Bill Knight that originated that style of carving. And there's still quite a few saddle makers around the Northwest that do that type of carving. One, for instance, is Dale Harwood and Mark Broger out of Montana, and they all still do what's considered Northwest style carving. So it's fairly popular out there, but wasn't really well known throughout the country. And I decided once back years ago that the Sheridan style has a lot of recognition, and everybody talks about the Sheridan style. Well, nobody was saying anything about the Northwest style. And so I decided it'd been going every bit as long as the Sheridan style and maybe even longer, and that it deserved a little recognition of its own. So I started teaching a Northwest style carving class in Sheridan every year. And now it's getting so that everybody, you say Northwest style, oh yeah, I know what that is. So that's good to be able to bring it into the forefront, because it's a really nice style of carving, and I like it that now more people are finding out about it instead of just the little community of saddle makers that was still doing that kind of work. So, well, I'd say if you love doing leather work and it's sort of your passion, a person should go for it. Some people claim that, you know, you can't make a living in the saddle business. Well, I've made my entire income off of leather in the saddle business for over 50 years now. And I've raised a family. I raised 6 kids and have bought a couple of pieces of real estate that, you know, in Spokane area that I did, you know, pretty good on. So, yeah, you can make a living in the leather industry, in the saddle making. Maybe not a living where you're going to make the kind of income that, say, a union type job would give you, but you make enough that you can survive on really good. And if you enjoy doing this kind of thing, I feel I've made my living at my hobby for the last 50 years, and you can't hardly do better than that, I don't think.